Have you heard of the chance meeting that may have saved all of Middle-earth from Sauron? At the end of the Third Age, after the One Ring is destroyed and Sauron is defeated, what remained of the Fellowship dwelt at Minas Tirith for a time, mostly waiting for Aragorn's coronation, but also enjoying the time together and especially asking Gandalf anything they had ever wondered. With his work complete, Gandalf was very open with his answers, though they often didn't understand most of them. In this particular occasion, Gimli and Frodo inquired how the quest for Erebor, the tale told in The Hobbit, came about, why Bilbo of all people was chosen to go along, and how Gandalf was ever able to convince the proud Thorin Oakenshield to take Bilbo along. So Gandalf tells them of his chance meeting with Thorin. Gandalf admits that at the time, he was only thinking of the perilous state of the North and its defenses. Though Sauron had not returned to any kind of formidable power yet, Gandalf had confirmed that he was responsible for the deepening and growing shadow over Mirkwood from the fortress of Dol Guldur. Sauron was reclaiming as many of his rings of power as he could, and was searching for news of the One. Not only was there Sauron's growing power to contend with, but just a little ways north was the desolation of Smaug the Golden, greatest of all dragons of his time. Gandalf knew as soon as Sauron was strong enough that he would attack Rivendell. There were only the dwarves of the Iron Hills to prevent any assault northward, and they had Smaug to worry about too. And Sauron could use the dragon to terrible effect in any offensive to reclaim his old stronghold in Angmar. So Gandalf urged the White Council, whose prominent members included Saruman, the head of the council, Galadriel, Gandalf, and Elrond, to attack Dol Guldur and force Sauron out before he amassed any more power. Unknown to him at the time, but Saruman had come to desire the One Ring for himself. Saruman hoped that if Sauron was left alone, the One Ring would reveal itself in an attempt to be reunited with its master. So he overruled Gandalf, and thus Sauron was permitted to remain. These concerns weighed on Gandalf as he traveled to the Shire, hoping for a little rest. When he stopped at the village of Bree for the night, to his surprise, Thorin Oakenshield, who was traveling to his home that lay further east than the Shire in the mountains of Ered Luin, approached him and asked for his advice. It was the last person Gandalf would ever expect to be asked for advice from, Thorin Oakenshield, a mighty proud dwarf carrying deeply ingrained grievances. You see, Thorin is of the House of Durin, the most famous dwarf lineage. The dwarves of Durin accomplished some of the greatest deeds among dwarves. For one, they founded Moria and made it the wealthiest and richest dwarf kingdom of its time. But that line was also fraught with misfortune, starting when they awoke the Balrog deep within Moria. Forced to flee their once magnificent kingdom, Thorin's grandfather Thror settled in the Lonely Mountain in Erebor and became king under the mountain. Again, the House of Durin prospered, and rumors of the wealth and grandeur of the Lonely Mountain grew. The rumors spread until they finally reached Smaug. Smaug descended upon Erebor without warning in a fiery blast. Thror and Thrain, who was Thorin's father, barely escaped with their lives through a secret door in the mountainside. And after Smaug destroyed the dwarves in the nearby town of Dale, he made the Lonely Mountain and all its wealth his home. The fortunes of Thorin's family continued to spiral downwards. Thror, his family, kinsfolk, and faithful followers were forced to live in exile, barely scraping by a living. A few years later, Thror gives Thrain his Ring of Power, the last of the 7 dwarven rings, bequeaths the vengeance of Smaug to Thrain, and goes back to Moria to re-inhabit it, where he is immediately killed by an orc. This spurs the dwarves to wage war against the orcs for the death of Thror, and they win a bitter victory. The orcs are defeated, but at the cost of many dwarven lives. Afterwards, Thrain, Thorin, and all that remained of their following wandered until at last they made a home in exile in the far east of Ered Luin. For years they labored, eking out what living they could, but Thrain's heart burned for gold and the wealth of the Lonely Mountain until he could take it no longer, and he left. Not much is known of what became of him, and that is how Thorin became the heir of Durin. Still in exile with moderate comfort amassed, nothing compared to the Lonely Mountain, Thorin brooded on the past misfortunes of his family, and the vengeance on the dragon he had inherited from his father and grandfather, until his heart was stirred to action. That is what got the proud dwarf to ask Gandalf for advice when he happened to run into him journeying home. Luckily for Thorin, Gandalf was in an obliging mood. He saw Thorin's desire to retake Erebor as a possible solution to the problematic northern defenses, so Gandalf agreed to visit Thorin in Ered Luin after a stay in the Shire. While Gandalf visited the Shire, he promptly heard news of Bilbo, whom he had noticed some years back for his adventurous spirit, something unheard of in hobbits. According to the news, Bilbo's parents had recently died and he was still unmarried. Not only that, but he had only become more strange over the years. He would go off by himself for days and was seen talking to strange folk, even dwarves. For a hobbit, that's downright unheard of. Gandalf saw a plan taking shape. A great dragon in his lust for gold, with his keen hearing and sense of smell. The sturdy, heavy-booted dwarves with their old burning grudge. And the quick, soft-footed hobbit with no attachments, itching for an adventure in the wide world outside the Shire. And upon further reflection on the attack of Smaug and the narrow escape of Thorin and Thrain, Gandalf remembered during his journey nearly 100 years ago to Dol Guldur to confirm Sauron as the source of power there. He had run into a crazed dwarf in the dungeons who gave him a map with a key and told him these were for his son. He also raved about a great ring, and it now occurred to Gandalf that he had found Thrain and had in his possession the map and the key to the secret door through which Thorin and Thrain had escaped the Lonely Mountain all those years ago. A plan of stealth then, using the secret door and a small, quiet hobbit that Smaug had probably never smelt before. Armed with this plan, Gandalf set off to the Blue Mountains to speak with Thorin. It took some convincing, as Thorin's plans were all of battle and war, as if he really were King Thorin II and not an exile. But Thorin consented, and as we know from the tale of the Hobbit, all arrived in an unexpected party at Bag End to a surprised Bilbo. According to Gandalf, the meeting at Bag End and the dwarves' first impression of Bilbo was far worse than we're told in the Hobbit book. The impression we get from the book, which is authored by Bilbo, was that really only Thorin was skeptical, and you could tell he was proud. But the meeting was so bad that it almost ended the whole quest before it started. For one, Bilbo had changed, and his dreams of adventure had dwindled. For another, he had grown fat and greedy, and nothing could be more dismaying than the idea of his old dreams actually coming true. The dwarves thought him fatuous, and Thorin was much more indignant and contemptuous than Bilbo had perceived. Thorin, being a proud dwarf, thought Gandalf had planned this whole affair simply to make a fool of him. But Gandalf, seeing the quest was in jeopardy, saw now was the time to reveal the map and key. When Thorin saw them, he really made up his mind to follow Gandalf's plan of secrecy, without the need of this burglar, this hobbit. With the use of the hidden door, he saw a chance of finding out what was going on inside the mountain, and maybe, just maybe, recovering a few pieces of treasure. But he had no intention of taking Bilbo. For some reason, Gandalf knew Bilbo had to go with them and argued late into the night with Thorin, trying to persuade him. Thorin kept pointing out how soft Bilbo was, and could not see why Gandalf was so insistent on him taking Bilbo with them. Again and again, he accused Gandalf of setting this whole thing up just to make a mockery of him. And finally, suspicious as ever, he accuses Gandalf of having ulterior motives. This is something with which Gandalf can heartily agree, and he tells Thorin that if he didn't have an ulterior motive, he wouldn't be helping Thorin in the first place. Gandalf tells Thorin that if he doesn't take Bilbo, his quest will fail, not to mention that Bilbo has Gandalf's trust and loyalty. That finally settled it for Thorin, for dwarves understand and regard loyalty highly, and Thorin begrudgingly consented to take Bilbo on the quest. The rest of the story is told in the tale of the Hobbit. Smaug was defeated, and Gandalf finally convinced the White Council to attack Dol Guldur, though they merely succeeded in chasing Sauron from the fortress, and he fled south to Barad-dûr. But the perilous situation in the north, thanks to the small group of dwarves, a hobbit, and the courage of the men of Dale, was now less precarious. Without the quest, Gandalf assures Gimli and Frodo back in Minas Tirith, without Thorin, Sauron would have been able to throw his full might at Rivendell or Lothlorien, and how would the Ring-Bearer have made it past that? Instead, Sauron was forced to send his main assault against Gondor, and that's how Middle-earth was saved by a chance meeting in Bree.